We've seen slight increases in those populations as well as we've progressed, but we really haven't seen those return to any sort of pre-COVID levels, and they really account for a very small percentage of our jail population on a day-to-day basis. Justice court misdemeanors as well, they are perennially a really small contributor to the jail population, and sort of as anticipated, they have continued to remain low in the COVID era. So sort of the takeaway here is that by the end of August, the volume of district court holds has essentially returned to our pre-COVID levels. And I think the point that I want to make here is if the jail were to begin admitting individuals charged with nonviolent misdemeanors again, or we saw rebounds in some of our other populations, we could reasonably expect that the jail population would be back at or above what we saw in the pre-COVID era. So moving on, I want to focus specifically on the felony population at the jail. Here, this is sort of the same chart that we saw on the slide earlier. This is our felony population, except it zoomed in on our period of growth, so April 1st through August 31st of this year. And the bottom blue line here represents 2020, and then we're comparing that to what we saw over the same time period last year in 2019. We can see that the rate of growth between April 1st and August 31st shows a generally upward trend in both 2019 and 2020. So I think this reasonably sort of points to some of the seasonal fluctuations we might expect in the jail population. However, I would sort of ask you to notice that the rate of growth in 2020 is quite a bit steeper than in 2019, and that by the end of August, the felony population, sort of as discussed, is more or less in line with what was seen in 2019. If we focus specifically on the pretrial population, we see that this is even more true, where the volume in 2019 of our pretrial population is more or less stable throughout this time period. But in 2020, we see that the rate of growth is quite a bit steeper than in 2019. The difference in incarcerated pretrial individuals between 2019 and 2020 is about 55 individuals here on April 1st. And we can see by the time that we hit August, we actually are seeing more individuals incarcerated pretrial at the felony level than we did in 2019. Now, the majority of our jail is folks on a pretrial or awaiting action status. So they contribute, again, to the majority of our jail population. We don't typically have as many sentenced folks, and in terms of trends, the opposite is true. Generally trending downward in 2020 relative to what we saw in 2019. But again, I want to just emphasize that the sentenced population is a much smaller proportion of our jail population, just typically than our pretrial population is. So the next sort of visual I want to draw your attention to below here is the average length of stay for individuals who are confined at the jail. And what I want to highlight in particular here are these two average lines, which are the dashed lines, so the average over this period. What we see here is that the average length of stay for the confined population, approximately 102 days in 2020, is significantly higher in 2019, which is 83 days. So we're talking, approximately 19 days that folks are staying longer on average this year relative to last year. Now, this can be attributable to a couple things. One of those is sort of a hardening of the jail population. And what I mean by that is we have a higher proportion of more violent, serious offenders, which are going to typically stay longer and typically bring that average up. But I think I also want to acknowledge that we've heard about backlogs in our court system, particularly in district court, and delays due to COVID-19. And so folks are just potentially moving through our court system slower. they're experiencing more time potentially between hearings, they're experiencing more continuances in their court case. And so as a result, they're just staying in jail longer than they would in non-COVID times. Now at the end of June here, and then again at the end of August, we see the average length of stay for the confined population sort of dip down into 2019 levels. And I think this is sort of a combination of a reduction in that sentence population that I just talked about, in combination with an increase in new admissions, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. But new admissions by the nature are going to have a lower length of stay, right? These are people who are coming in off the street, they've just been arrested. By default, their length of stay on the day that they are admitted is 0. So they're mathematically just going to bring that average down as we see more and more new admissions. Now moving over to the bottom right corner, this is sort of a different look, but it's looking at the percentage of our felony population that has been incarcerated for at least 30 days. So in 2020, on average, we're talking 68% of the confined felony population has been incarcerated for 30 days or more during this period. Last year, we were only at about 57%. If we look at just the pure volume, you can see it's sort of difficult to make out the trends. We have a bit of an ebb and flow over this period. But what we see is that the number of individuals incarcerated for 30 days or more in 2020 is lower than what we saw in 2019. But yet, if we look down here at the average length of stay, on average, that length of stay is longer. So the point here is that even if we have less people in jail, it's being offset by the fact that they are just staying longer and being incarcerated for a longer period, particularly during that pretrial phase. So this leads us into sort of what is happening over at district court. Court data can be very difficult to work with just in terms of the format and the extraction of what data is available. So we don't have a ton of in-depth data on what is happening, but certainly an important thing that we look at is what is happening with cases filed and versus disposed. So we see that in 2020, our case filings are actually, for the most part, higher than they were in 2019. So we're seeing more cases coming in. In our dispositions, particularly in the sort of height of the COVID period, say April and May, and maybe a little bit into June as well, are lower, right? So we're seeing more cases coming in, but not as many cases leaving. This certainly, again, contributes to the idea that perhaps things at the court aren't processing as quickly as they typically do, and folks are staying longer. It also points to the fact that we might just be seeing more, we are seeing more cases than we did for the same time period last year. So that also can certainly overburden the courts and make things take longer for everybody. So I think taken together, what these data points sort of suggest is that there's an existence of a population at the detention center that has become more stagnant and is experiencing slower turnover than in 2019. Again, I just want to stress that, again, even though we're seeing less individuals in total incarcerated than we did in 2019, they're just staying longer. So that's going to contribute to growth in our jail population as we move forward, and particularly as we add new admissions. So on the next slide here, we're looking focusing on how many folks for felony charges are coming into the detention facility. On the top visual here, we're looking at the rolling 7-day average for felony bookings, again, for that same time period of April 1st through August 31st of this year, and compared to 2019. We see that from the start of April, we sort of climbed slowly but consistently to, again, where by the end of August, we're a little bit below, but we're really getting close to being on par with 2019 in terms of felony admissions. And so while and also I think it's important to note the trends here again, while the volume of bookings for 2020 for this period is largely lower than in 2019, we're seeing a more clear upward trend in the rate of bookings this year compared to last year. Now, if we look at how do bookings compare to releases, this is looking at the rolling 7-day average of felony bookings compared to felony releases and calculating the difference. So the important line here is the 0 line. Anytime we're above 0, those are days where we're experiencing more admissions than we are releases. That's going to contribute to growth. And on the left here, we have 2020, and on the right, we have 2019. Again, I want to highlight the trends here that it's slight in 2020, but again, we are trending upward. We're seeing more admissions relative to releases, again, contributing to growth. Whereas for this same period in 2019, this time of year, we started to see a downward trend. Again, anytime we're above that 0 line, we're experiencing some growth, and we're certainly seeing more periods of growth and not as many periods of our population shrinking. Contributing with the fact that folks are staying longer, we sort of just have this recipe where we have different populations coming in, but they're both contributing to consistent growth in our jail population. So the last slide that I'm going to touch on is looking at sort of the composition of our jail population and specifically focusing on bookings. Now, like I said, our bookings per month are down compared to 2019 overall, but we're certainly trending upward since April or so, fairly consistently, whereas in non-COVID times, we're typically very stable in the amount of bookings we see throughout this period. A couple populations that I want to highlight are certainly violent offenses. Here, we're seeing, on average, each month during this period, a much higher level of violent admissions than we are for violent offenses than we are in 2019. For drug offenses, we're really on par with what we saw in 2019. Just take that into note when I talk about sort of the proportional composition of our jail population in a moment. So down here, what we're looking at is the share of bookings that we saw between April and August based on what an individual's highest charge was at the time of admission. Sort of as I mentioned, I think the things to note here are that in 2020, proportionally, we're seeing much more violent admissions. We're also seeing higher admissions, again, proportionally, not necessarily in terms of pure volume, but in terms of proportion for drug offenses, as well as property offenses. Slight uptick in traffic. Where we've really seen the reductions is in probation violations, as well as this miscellaneous category. Miscellaneous category, this again is sort of a catch-all, but this is going to capture typically charges such as someone who is a fugitive who's coming in on an extra-jurisdictional warrant, someone who is failing to register as a sexual or a violent offender. We've also seen a reduction in that space. But the thing that has remained consistent across these two periods is that warrants account for a significant portion of our admissions. That's true pre-COVID, and that is true post-COVID. If we look at district court, we see that really sort of starting in the early part of this summer in June. The amount of arrest and bench warrants that are issued out of district court are quite a bit higher than we saw in 2019. Again, these could be for an individual failing to appear for a court appearance, It could be for a violation of the conditions of release that were imposed upon them. It could also be, in the case of arrest warrants, perhaps to originate a case. Charges were brought against an individual, but that individual is not in custody. So district court issues a warrant to have that individual arrested. But again, the takeaway here is that even though our population has changed in other areas, warrants really are still contributing a large amount to our admissions. And so what are the takeaways here? I think what we want to communicate is that the detention facility has really experienced significant growth in its jail population over the last 5 months due to a combination of both increasing felony admissions relative to releases and slower turnover in our felony population. I will say the preliminary data suggests that through the first half of September, the daily population is continuing to remain high. We're typically sitting in the mid 160s at this point, occasionally those high 160s. Certainly growth in the jail population, given the time we're in, has important implications for public health. Certainly as we head into the fall and winter and COVID continues to be a concern. Admissions are a particular concern as more people from the community are entering the detention facility, increasing exposure risk for both staff and inmates. And what we're currently seeing is essentially our felony population return to pre-COVID levels. But what's different this year is that a higher percentage of that population is falling under this pretrial or awaiting action category. As I sort of mentioned early in the presentation, I think this puts us in a somewhat tenuous position where if we were begin to see rebounds in our other populations, either just because that's how things play out or because of a change in policy or practice, I think it's very reasonable to expect that we would see our jail population return to pre-COVID levels, if not exceed those levels. I think this is an important moment for us in the Criminal Justice Services Division, as well as the CJCC and Missoula at large. When we applied for the Safety and Justice Challenge Grant, which were funded under the county and city and the criminal justice partners sort of applied for that grant with the idea that we would take a different approach to how we administer criminal justice. And so I think what we're seeing right now as a return to normal indicates we still have some work to do, and that returning to normal in our criminal legal system should not necessarily be taken as a sign of success. The county has been invited to apply for a renewal grant from the MacArthur Foundation to continue our work in this space and working with all our criminal justice partners here in Missoula. And so I think as we move forward, we're really asking people to become active participants in the CJCC and in that process, and think about what are policy changes, what are programs and initiatives that we can support and implement that can put us in a better position and improve outcomes for everyone. So with that said, I'm going to turn my camera back on here, and I'm happy if folks have questions to answer those.
All right, thanks so much, Quinn. We will now take questions from council members. And as chair, I will ask the first question. So a lot of really great data that you presented, and I was trying to follow along in terms and kind of parse out what it means. And I would like for you to kind of talk a little bit more about the felony population. You said that they're staying longer, it's increasing, they're staying longer, but you also said that there is a larger share of them that are in there for the violent crimes. Mm-hmm. And so, you can make a lot of commentary about that. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, a global economic crisis, and our social safety nets are not as robust as maybe they should be. But it's like, I understand that that population is in jail and is staying longer. And how does that compare? I mean, in terms of you had it towards the full share of 2019, but I guess I'm having a hard time comparing the two and trying to understand, is it like the felony population is staying longer because the violent offenders are in there longer, or
Mhm.
is there other data points below that?
Yeah, so it's sort of a combination, and what makes this so difficult is that we have a lot of complex dynamics that are happening at the same time, and trying to disentangle those is challenging. So what we're seeing at this point is we are seeing an increase over 2019 in the pure volume of people admitted to the detention center on a felony offense, on a violent felony offense.
Mhm.
We are also seeing that the proportion of our admissions is increasing in violent offense relative to last year. A question I got at the last time I gave this presentation is, is this a sign that violent crime is increasing in Missoula? I think that's a difficult question. I think what we're seeing with it in terms of our admissions says maybe. That very well may be happening. Now, folks that are alleged of a violent felony offense, those are incredibly serious offenses, and may have typically the longest court cases that we're going to see. So certainly as we see a higher number of those people coming into our jail, they are going to bring that average length of stay up, just by the nature that they have more complex cases than perhaps, say, a property crime case. So that's certainly going to contribute. So what we're trying to do with the data that we have is try and disentangle how much is this just the fact that the types of admissions that we're seeing are different and maybe taking longer, versus what is attributable to the fact that the court was shut down for a period of time and on many cases is now playing catch up, in addition to the fact that they're seeing more cases than they did last year. So they just have more to deal with, and their processing times are slower. I think what the data suggests is we have a combination of both. The composition of our admissions is changing, but we also know from talking to stakeholders and what we're just seeing in the court data that cases are just taking longer to process than they did last year. So it's a combination of both.
Thanks. That was a really great answer to probably a very ineloquent question that I garbled out at you. So thank you. That was what I was trying to extrapolate. And I understand that that data is not just as easy to maybe point out on line graphs. So thank you for that. So,
yeah, for sure.
Miss Merritt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've got a couple of quick questions, if you allow. I think I'll start with this slide that we're looking at right here, Quinn. So the boxes down at the bottom, does that represent just felony charges?
It does, yes.
Okay, I guess my question was, in that category that is warrants, do we have a breakdown there of whether the underlying offense was a violent offense or not?
Yeah, so that's unfortunately a limitation of the data that's collected at the detention center. When an individual is booked in on a warrant, we can tell that it was a warrant, typically whether it was for a failure to appear, and then the severity of the underlying charge, whether it was a felony or a misdemeanor, but we do not have the underlying charge itself. So for example, in that warrant category, those could be a failure to appear where the underlying charge was felony theft. It could also be failure to appear where the underlying charge was aggravated assault. Unfortunately, that's just a limitation of the data where we can't tell the difference between the two. The only way would be to go into the individual court record for that case and cross-reference with the warrant.
Which I guess that brings up another question for me is there any efforts underway to be able to collect that data so we can make that determination?
Yes, so there have been some conversations with both folks at the detention center as well as our department about what changes we can make to their record management system to make this possible. I think this is a combination of both just a human capacity issue and a technical issue. On the human capacity side, I think the conversation there is that the booking officers who are recording this information, they're often under stressful situations depending on the timing. A Saturday night could be really busy. They don't necessarily have the time to do this level of record keeping, and they just might not have the staff to do that. That's one side of things. The other side is just the record management system that they operate under just doesn't really offer a good place to record this information, right? Because essentially for anyone coming in on a warrant, you're going to need to record two charges. You need to record the warrant charge itself, but then also what is the original underlying charge that initiated that warrant. And so again, this is a technical limitation, but I think we are certainly having some conversations with them. I think it's something we are considering for the renewal grant is how can we improve the record management system and work with the vendor to make things a little more seamless in terms of the record keeping. I will say that this issue around warrants and what's the underlying charge, it's not the only thing. There are several other areas that we've identified where we might be able to make some improvements and would aid us in sort of the analysis that we're ultimately able to do.
If I could have one more quick question, Chair.
Sure.
So earlier on in the presentation, I think one of your takeaways is that perhaps we should continue the policy of not admitting people with nonviolent misdemeanors or who are picked up on a warrant where the underlying offense is a nonviolent misdemeanor. Am I characterizing that correctly?
I think I want to present that carefully. I think in terms of a reduction in our jail population, at a time when it was needed, particularly around COVID, that certainly has aided us in keeping our jail numbers low during this sort of public health crisis, if you will. Whether or not that should continue, I think that's a decision that the CJCC and the larger Missoula community need to decide whether or not they're comfortable with, and whether or not we're seeing benefits to that policy. We are hoping to look at what are rates of pretrial failure, so either folks that are committing a new offense while on pretrial release or failing to show up for a court appearance, and comparing that during the COVID era to pre-COVID era in hoping to shine some light on how successful that is. But again, I think that's going to be a difficult task just given the nature and limitations of some of the data that we're working with. And I think largely, I just think that's a broader conversation that the criminal justice stakeholders and just community need to have moving forward.
Thanks.
Great, thanks so much. So I have three additional council members in the queue, and I do want to flag that we are going till 10:05 today. There's one member of the audience, and if they care to make comment, raise your hand. Otherwise, we will continue to go with council questions. Ms. Cheryl.
Thank you, and thank you, Quinn. This is a great presentation, and untangling this is really complicated. I kept wanting to press pause on what you were saying and just stop and think about the data for a second. So anyway, I appreciate the complexity of it. One of the things that stood out to me is when I was looking at, and I don't remember where the chart was, but it was the sentence, you'd said that the sentenced population was lower than the pre-trial daily population. And then in some other chart in there, you said, correct me if I'm wrong, but court cases filed versus those that were disposed of. So one concern I have, of course, is that people are waiting for their trial and staying in jail longer. And I'm just, could you talk about the relationship there?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. So obviously our felony population, again, I just want to stress, like, these are typically complex cases. They've been alleged of serious offenses. They typically have high bond amounts. Where typically, the lowest bond amounts that we typically see at the felony level are $5,000 to $10,000, but it is not uncommon for these bond amounts to be $50,000 plus. So the ability of a defendant to post that amount is certainly a limitation. And so we do see quite a few folks who are detained at the jail on a felony hold while they are sort of progressing through their case. Now, during the early stages of COVID, certainly the courthouse was shut down for a period of time. Jury trials were suspended. What this resulted in, and or at least what we're hearing from folks in the court, is that this resulted in a backlog to get those cases heard. And anecdotally, what we saw is that folks who originally had hearings scheduled for, say, April or late March had those hearings continued, which essentially means they were delayed to June or later part of June, perhaps early July. So in non-COVID times, right, these people would have had their cases heard in March or April, and their case would have proceeded. And would they have gone out? Would they have not? I mean, typically, if they're going to be sentenced and they have a high bond amount, typically they'll remain in jail, but then they'll eventually be transferred to the Department of Corrections once their case reaches its final disposition. If we're stretching that timeline out, we just have more people sitting in jail awaiting action on their case. So the point that I emphasize there is you have this population that, because their cases are moving slower, they're sort of stagnant. They're not going anywhere, and their cases are being more drawn out. On top of that, when you add in these new admissions, certainly new cases that are being filed into district court, we have a population that's not turning over, but at the same time, we're adding more and more new felony folks. And so we see that growth, whereas, say, if we had that same increase in admissions, but people were turning over at their sort of typical rate, we wouldn't see that growth.
Thank you. That's it. I appreciate that clarification.
Great. Thank you so much. Ms. Harp.
Thanks. Quinn, could you go back to the screen or the statistics that talked about the length of stay?
Sure. Yeah. Okay, should be here. Yeah, do you see it?
Yes, there it is. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. So if I'm reading this correctly, here over on the far left bottom, we're looking at our lengths of stay tending to at least be tracking above 80 days. Is that correct? Whether
That's
it's
correct.
for 2019 or 2020. Okay.
Correct.
If I was to be arrested for some charge, what would help me reduce my stay in jail?
Yeah. So again, I think a lot is going to come down to what is happening at your initial appearance. So once you're arrested, you're going before a judge. For felonies, typically you're going to go before a justice court judge before you transfer up to district court. And they're going to consider the allegations, and they're going to decide what your bond amount is, if anything, and then what conditions of release you will be under should you either post bond or if you're released on your own recognizance. Now, let's say you have a really serious offense and you have $50,000 bond. If you can't post that at any point, then you're just going to remain detained, and there's not much you as the defendant can do other than wait for your case to process. If you are either able to post bond or release at your initial appearance, certainly complying with the conditions of release will help reduce the amount of time that it takes your case to process. I would say probably the biggest contributors to why cases ultimately stretch out is individuals that are failing to appear for their court appearances or repeatedly violating their conditions of release, where the court and the state perhaps feel the need to issue warrants to bring you back into compliance. We hear anecdotes of defendants who just repeatedly fail to appear over and over again, and it takes a huge amount of time to move to that ultimately next hearing to progress the case because they spend so much time dealing with the violations. So certainly the more the defendant is able to comply with the conditions of their release, the quicker their case will move. Now, I think potentially, and certainly our department is thinking about this, is there's a lot of things that we could potentially do to set defendants up better for success. And I think that's a conversation that, again, the CJCC needs to have. As a defendant, again, I think compliance is certainly the big part of the equation. On the other side of that, we have the court thinking about how are they going to handle compliance violations. Do they need to issue a warrant when someone fails to appear? Did the person just simply forget that they had a court case that day or had a trouble arranging transportation when it's like there was no malintent, right? These are decisions that play out in the courtroom that can seriously affect the length of the case.
Great. Thank you very much. I hope to see this again in hopefully just a couple of months. See the update.
Great, thank you so much. So Ms. Becerra, your final question, and then we will take public comment.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all information. It's really helpful, and I'm glad to know that we're tracking all this data. And as a non-data person, my question might sound pretty rudimentary, so I apologize, but you mentioned that people are tending to stay longer, the stay is longer. And to me, I think that really prompted my question, which is the why. Why are people going to jail? And is the data that you are collecting being collected with the input of agencies that are working towards addressing the why? We shouldn't have people going to jail to begin with. And so just wondering if that the data that you are collecting is in coordination, is collected, or are the questions that we're asking being informed by what other agencies in the community are trying to do to address the why?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And again, I just want to highlight the complexity of the dynamics here. The presentation that I gave today was purely based off jail data and a little bit of very simplistic court data. We face a couple challenges in certainly the complexity of the data to work with, and that's across the board. That's not only in the jail and the court, but that's true of the attorney's office as well, law enforcement. I think what we see in those scenarios is that a lot of this data is coming from case management systems. They weren't necessarily designed to do analysis, but we're trying to use them for that exact purpose. Getting at the why, I think, is, again, really challenging given the nature and complexity of some of these cases. So we are hoping to coordinate, and we are trying to coordinate with our other criminal justice partners to sort of get a larger picture of what's happening. Because again, jail and court data only provides just sort of a small sliver of the other dynamics that can be happening in this space. But it has been a challenge at times, both capacity wise, who has the technical capacity and know-how to do this work, and also just pure staff time. In addition to the sensitivity of this data, certainly a lot of it is protected information. And so gaining access to some of this information is often quite difficult. So again, we're not quite seeing the whole picture. I think what we have been doing thus far is presenting the data that we have to our partners, and then asking them, how does this resonate with you in terms of what you're experiencing on the street and in the courtroom, at the jail, with the clients that you serve? Does it back that up? If so, great. How can we dig deeper? If not, where can we go from here? Where might be some of the discrepancies? I will say, in terms of trying to assess why people are going to jail, why they are held, I really don't think that's necessarily the place for a quantitative analysis such as this. I really think that's going to be a more qualitative look at specific individuals, where people can come together and sort of dive deep into a case, and in all likelihood, multiple cases. Often defendants are having multiple cases in multiple courts. And I think, sort of as Kristen alluded to at the very start of today, the jail review team is sort of part of that, right? Trying to find a way to bring these different partners together that have different looks at a case and try and assess, why is this person in jail? Why are they being held? What can we do for them that's different than what we've been doing? So again, I think that we're trying to accomplish that work, but we've had a lot of hurdles that we've had to come over to even get to this point.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Becerra. Thank you, Mr. Ziegler, for the great presentations, good discussion. We will continue to track this information. So this is an informational item only, so there's no motion needed. We are over time. We have one member of the public who has been with us for the entirety, and we will allow them to make public comment, and then we will quickly wrap up because we are over time, and our staff needs to do their COVID protocol to switch between committees. So Jeremy Marrow, you should be able to make your public comment now.
Hi there. I wonder, incidentally, I'm a public defender, but I don't speak for the public defender's office. I'm wondering if I'm right. I forgot who asked the question. What would happen if I were arrested? What would dictate how long I'm in jail? And I'm curious, isn't the number one reason not having the funds to bond out? I also think it'd be interesting to find out what the case outcomes are for people who are pretrial detained versus those who are not. And lastly, very curious if there are a lot of release condition violations, and I'm wondering if that has to do with more release conditions being imposed. And if so, if that's lowered the cash bond people need to get out.
Great, thank you so much. So this is public comment, excellent data points to bring up to hopefully incorporate in our next presentation. And we are over time. So Quinn, I don't know if you just have like a sentence or two in response, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all fantastic points. I just want to highlight, I think the question was, why do cases take so long? But in terms of why people are in jail, I think the commenter was exactly right. It's your ability to pay to get out. And if you can't pay, you're going to sit. And the other terms of points is, are people potentially detained for violating of the conditions release as a function of the amount of conditions that are imposed on them? Absolutely. That is, again, a very possible driver. And I think, again, I just want to say that all the points that were brought up were great and are things that we are hoping to look at moving forward.
Great. Thank you everyone so much. Apologies to the staff for going over time. I know this puts you in a little bit of a crunch, but thank you everyone for joining us for today's Public Safety and Health Committee. We will now be adjourned.